Welcome to Wisdom for the Present, where we take ancient truth and bring it into clear modern understanding. This episode uses AI-generated narration based on human research and written material. So, I want you, the listener, the learner in this journey, to imagine a society that is just like in its absolute ultimate golden age.
Yeah, total boom time.
Right. Like the economy is booming at an unprecedented rate. The military is undefeated. They're expanding the national borders. The upper class is just thriving, building these sprawling winter and summer estates.
Living the dream.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And if you were an outside observer looking at the macroeconomic data, you would say this civilization has totally peaked. But beneath that glittering, wealthy surface, the social fabric is completely rotting away.
It's just falling apart, yeah.
So today, we're going on an exclusive, in-depth, deep dive into an ancient text that reads, honestly, like an autopsy of a collapsing society. A text that feels like it was written literally about the 21st century.
Oh, absolutely.
We are looking at the biblical book of Hosea, specifically chapters 4 through 14.
It truly is a remarkable and often pretty disturbing piece of literature. And I think it's important to state right up front how we're approaching this today.
Yeah, let's set the ground rules.
Right, because we are not just going to view this purely as some, ancient religious document or a dry historical artifact that you just catalog and put on a shelf.
Nobody wants that.
Exactly. Our goal as your guides today is to help you extract the practical wisdom, the moral insight, and the direct life application from these ancient words. Because when you strip away the unfamiliar cultural markers like the ancient names and the farming references, you're looking at a literal masterclass in human psychology. It's the mechanics of societal collapse and the very real requirements for lasting transformation.
But before we get into those heavy-hitting insights, we really have to know what world this author was actually addressing, right?
Context is everything.
Because context isn't just background noise. Context changes the entire meaning of the text. So where are we? And what is actually happening on the ground when these words are being written?
Right. So the historical and human context here is crucial to, everything that follows. We are looking at the northern kingdom of ancient Israel, which the text often refers to as Ephraim.
Named after his dominant tribe.
Yeah, exactly. And the time frame is roughly the middle of the 8th century BCE. Specifically, this is during the reign of a king named Jeroboam II. And under Jeroboam II, Israel controlled the major international trade routes.
Like the big highways.
Yeah, specifically the Via Maris, which it connected Egypt to Mesopotamia. So this influx of trade wealth created a massive, just unbelievable economic boom.
So they're essentially like the geopolitical center of commerce at that moment. The money's just pouring.
It's pouring in. But, it created the ultimate Gilded Age. It was a culture marked by vast inequality. The wealth wasn't distributed at all. It was hoarded by an elite class that was, frankly, systematically crushing the agrarian poor. You had a legal system that was entirely corrupted by bribery.
Wow.
Yeah, and you had political assassinations happening constantly. Like in the years following Jeroboam II, kings were being overthrown in bloody coups left and right. It was a state of near anarchy at the highest levels of government. But spiritually and culturally, the defining characteristic of this era was syncretism.
Okay, we hear that word thrown around in academic circles, but what does syncretism actually look like in the daily life of an 8th century Israelite?
So syncretism is the blending of different religious beliefs and practices until they become this new compromised hybrid.
Like a mashup.
Yeah, a religious mashup. In this case, the people claim to still worship their traditional god, Yahweh, the god of the Exodus, the god of history and ethics, but they had completely mixed that worship with the cult of Baal.
And to understand this, you really have to understand who Baal was, right?
Exactly. Baal was a Canaanite storm and fertility god. He was the god of the dirt, the rain, and the crops.
Right, because when the Israelites originally came out of the desert, they were nomads. They didn't farm. But now they are farmers in a settled land.
Precisely. And if you are a farmer, you want the god who controls the rain, period.
Yeah, it makes pragmatic sense to them.
Right. And the worship of Baal was highly transactional. You performed certain rituals, which often involved temple prostitution, sympathetic magic, and agricultural offerings. And in exchange, the god gives you rain, crops, and wealth.
So it's basically religion as a cosmic vending machine.
That's exactly it. Put the coin in, get the blessing out. And Israel had adopted this mindset wholesale. They treated the ethical, covenantal relationship with Yahweh as just another transactional formula for economic success.
They wanted to hack the divine for profit.
Yes, they wanted the agricultural and economic output without any of the ethical obligations regarding, how they treated the poor or governed their society.
Yeah. That is such a vital point. They were trying to manipulate the system. Okay, let's unpack this, which brings us right into the opening argument of our deep dive. Chapter 4 begins with what the author frames as a divine lawsuit.
The Hebrew word is rib.
Right, a formal legal indictment. The text says God has a controversy or a legal charge against the inhabitants of the land. And the diagnosis is absolutely brutal.
It really is.
It says there is no truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God in the land. And because of this lack of foundational reality, there's just a cascade of boundary breaking, right? Swearing, lying, stealing, adultery, and bloodshed.
Total collapse.
It gets so bad that the text says the very land and its animals are mourning and wasting away.
The linguistic choices here are profound, that specific diagnosis. No truth, nor mercy, nor knowledge of God. The original commentaries on this text, scholars like Albert Barnes and Matthew Henry, they emphasize that this knowledge is not intellectual data.
It's not a pop quiz.
Right. The Hebrew concept of knowledge, yet, is not about passing a theology exam or memorizing historical facts. It implies deep relational intimacy and experiential alignment. To know God meant to live in a way that actively reflected his character in your daily dealings.
Yeah.
And without that foundational knowledge, the entire social fabric just unravels. The mutual agreements that hold society together, what the text calls truth and mercy, they just disintegrate into ruthless self-interest.
It's the difference between knowing about someone and actually knowing them through shared experience.
Yeah.
I mean, I can read a biography of a historical figure, but I don't know them.
Exactly.
This society had lost any actual lived connection to the reality of the divine. And the fallout was systemic. There's this phrase in chapter 4, verse 9 that is just chilling. It says, like people, like priest.
Yeah. That is the devastating observation by the prophet. It describes a systemic institutional failure where the leadership and the public are locked in this mutual feedback loop of corruption.
They're feeding off each other.
Totally. The priests were supposed to be the moral compass of the nation, right? The educators, the ones teaching truth and mercy. Instead, the text says the priests were actually eating up the sin of the people.
Okay, I have to stop you there.
Yeah.
Because that phrase, eating up the sin, sounds like something straight out of a horror movie. What does that actually mean mechanically?
Well, it refers to the economic structure of the ancient sacrificial system. The priests received a portion of the sin offerings and guilt offerings brought by the people as their food and livelihood.
Okay, I'm following.
Therefore, if the people were living ethical, righteous lives, there were fewer sin offerings.
Right.
But if the people were constantly sinning, constantly breaking the covenant, they were constantly bringing sacrifices to the altars. So the more the people sinned, the wealthier and better fed the priests became.
Oh, wow.
The religious leaders were actively profiting from the moral failure of the populace. They had a vested financial interest in the sickness of their own society.
Wait. So if I'm understanding this correctly, if the society was healthy, the priests went broke. But if the society was morally collapsing, the priests lived in luxury.
Exactly. They didn't want to cure the disease. They wanted to treat the symptoms forever because the treatment was highly lucrative. They were incentivized to turn a blind eye to the corruption and perhaps even quietly encourage it because every broken vow meant another piece of meat on the priest's table.
Okay, I have to push back here. Because when a modern listener hears about a divine lawsuit and God being angry about ancient priests and animal sacrifices, it's very easy to just dismiss this.
Sure, it sounds archaic.
Right. The immediate reaction is often, oh, this is just ancient tribal politics or, an angry deity demanding a cut of the profits. Why should a modern listener view this as anything more than ancient religious extortion? How is this profound wisdom for today?
It ceases to be ancient religious extortion when you look at the underlying mechanism. And that mechanism is the concept of a perverse incentive. The wisdom here is in identifying what happens when the institutions tasked with healing a society figure out how to monetize its sickness. The ancient priest eating the sin offering is just the earliest iteration of a pattern that defines modern civilization.
That completely flips the script. Let's talk about those modern perverse incentives, because suddenly this text feels incredibly relevant.
Oh, it's everywhere.
Think about the systems we interact with every single day.
Yeah.
Look at social media algorithms. The engineers who build these platforms know exactly what they are doing. These algorithms are specifically designed to eat the sin of our outrage, our division, and our tribalism.
Yes, absolutely.
The angrier we are at each other, the more anxiety we feel, the more we engage, and the more ad revenue the platform generates. The system does not want us to find peace, truth, or nuanced understanding. It literally profits from our relational brokenness and our lack of mercy.
That is a perfect modern translation of the ancient text. Or consider certain sectors of the modern economy that manage chronic issues rather than actually solving them. Look at the prison industrial complex. It profits from high recidivism rates. If prisons rehabilitate everyone, the private prison companies lose their government contracts. They literally need crime to survive.
It's wild when you think about it.
Or look at the junk food industry. Engineer designing hyper-palatable foods to create biological addiction, while the pharmaceutical industry profits from treating the resulting metabolic diseases. They are all, in the metaphorical sense of Hosea, eating the sin of the people.
And when you look at it that way, the prophet's diagnosis, no knowledge of God in the land, makes total sense. The lack of knowledge today isn't the lack of information.
Not at all.
I mean, we have the internet. We have access to the sum total of human data right in our pockets. What we lack is wisdom, ethical alignment, and genuine connection. We have systems running entirely on metrics, divorced from mercy.
And the question Hosea forces us to confront is, what happens to human beings when they are trapped in a system that prioritizes metric-driven success over truth and mercy? When metrics become the only goal, the humans involved cease to be neighbors to be loved. They just become expendable resources to be harvested.
It makes you wonder, doesn't it? It forces you to look in the mirror. Because, look, it's easy to point at social media CEOs or ancient corrupt priests. But the practical application here is much closer to home for you, the listener.
It always is.
Where in your own life, your career, or your business model, might you be subtly eating the sin of others? Are you benefiting from a broken system? Are you profiting off someone else's insecurity, ignorance, or lack of boundaries, rather than trying to empower them?
Yeah, are you managing a problem at work because it justifies your salary rather than actually solving it?
Exactly. It's a deeply uncomfortable question. But if you don't face it, you end up contributing to the very collapse Hosea is talking about.
And we have to recognize that this lack of truth doesn't just damage society on a macro institutional level. It exerts a massive psychological toll on the individual. Living in a society of perverse incentives where truth is relative and mercy is scarce eventually fragments the human psyche.
It tears you apart internally.
Which leads us to the vivid and frankly brilliant psychological profiling the author does in chapter 7.
Here's where it gets really interesting, because when the leadership is actively eating the sin and the social fabric tears, what does that actually do to the mind of the average person living in that society?
Hosea uses these everyday domestic metaphors to describe the pathology of a compromised identity, what he later calls a divided heart.
I love these metaphors. He calls them a cake not turned, an oven heated by a baker, and a silly dove without heart. Let's break down the mechanics of these metaphors, starting with the unturned cake.
So, to understand a cake not turned, you have to imagine the ancient process of baking bread. They didn't have modern enclosed ovens for this specific type of bread. They cooked flatbreads, essentially like thick pancakes, on hot stones or a griddle over an open fire.
Right.
If you put the dough on the searing hot stone and you never flip it, what happens? The bottom becomes completely scorched, burnt, black, and inedible. But because the heat never reaches the top remains raw, gooey, unformed dough. It's completely unpalatable on both sides.
You take a bite of that and it's a total disaster. But how does that translate to the human psyche?
The original commentators point out that this perfectly represents a half-hearted, inconsistent life. It is the psychology of a person who is entirely unbalanced. Perhaps they were red-hot and zealous in their public, performative religion, the burnt side, but completely raw, unformed, and immature in their private ethics and personal integrity.
Oh, I see.
Or, looking at the geopolitical context, they were deeply enmeshed and assimilated with the surrounding pagan cultures on one side, but still trying to claim they were Yahweh's special covenant people on the other.
It is a life lacking structural integrity. It is the very definition of hypocrisy.
It's the person who is a ruthless, cutthroat shark at the office from Monday to Friday, but then plays the pious, gentle saint on the weekend. The heat is unevenly applied.
Exactly.
And then the prophet moves from the unturned cake to the oven metaphor, which deals with what is happening beneath the surface.
Yes, the heart like an oven heated by a baker. The imagery in chapter 7, verses 4 through 6 is very specific. The baker prepares the dough, stokes a massive fire in the oven, and then, because the dough needs time to rise, he banks the fire and goes to sleep for the night.
So the fire isn't out?
No, the fire isn't put out. It is merely covered. It smolders secretly in the dark, maintaining a low, intense heat. But in the morning, when the baker stirs it and the oxygen hits it, it blazes out into a flaming fire.
That is a terrifying metaphor for the human subconscious. It is incredibly astute psychology. The text is using this to describe suppressed internal passions that are intentionally kept hidden. Historically, this referred to the political conspiracies of the day factions secretly plotting to overthrow the king, smiling at him in court while their treason smoldered in the dark, waiting for the morning of the coup to erupt.
But psychologically?
Psychologically, it represents hidden rage, suppressed resentment, or unchecked lust. A person might look perfectly calm and collected on the outside, but they have prepared their heart like a furnace. They are nurturing the resentment. They are just waiting for the right opportunity. And when the morning comes, when the right trigger occurs, that suppressed desire explodes into destructive action.
And the tragedy is, when the explosion happens, everyone around them is shocked. They seem so normal. It came out of nowhere. But Hosea is saying, no. It didn't come out of nowhere. The fire was burning all night. The baker knew exactly what he was doing. And that internal chaos, the raw dough, the smoldering fire, creates a state of perpetual anxiety. Which brings us to the third metaphor, the silly dove without heart.
Yes.
The text says in chapter 7, verse 11, that Ephraim is like a silly dove, calling to Egypt, then flying over to Assyria.
To understand the profound anxiety of the silly dove, we have to look at the geopolitical map of the 8th century BCE. Ancient Israel was a tiny strip of land located directly on the land bridge between the two massive, violent superpowers of the ancient world.
The heavyweights.
Yeah. To the south was the ancient, established empire of Egypt. To the northeast was the rising, terrifying military juggernaut of the Assyrian Empire, under kings like Tiglath-Pileser III. Israel was caught right in the middle.
Not a great place to be.
No. And instead of maintaining their internal integrity and trusting in their covenant with God, Israel's leaders were frantically operating out of fear. When they felt threatened by Assyrian expansion, they flew to Egypt, paying them massive tributes for military protection. When Egypt looked weak, they panicked and flew to Assyria, essentially bribing the wolf not to eat them.
So the silly dove is a bird lacking the sense to stay in the safety of its own dovecote. It flies out in a blind panic.
Exactly. A dove is a prey animal. By flying back and forth between these empires, it is seeking security in the talons of the very birds of prey that are hunting it. It is an irrational trauma response. They're running toward their devourers because they mistake power for safety.
Okay, let's bring this into the 21st century, because this dove metaphor is one of the most accurate descriptions of modern anxiety I've ever heard.
It really hits home.
It does. When someone realizes their internal life is a chaotic mess, when they have that divided heart, they panic. And what's the easiest way to hide internal chaos? External noise and frantic movement. Think about it. When you're stressed out, when you feel that internal panic rising about your career, your finances, or your relationships, what do? Do you flit frantically from one quick fix to another?
The modern empires we fly to are rarely geographic nations. They're systems of coping.
Yes. Do you fly to Egypt by mindlessly scrolling social media for 3 hours to numb the anxiety, seeking shelter in an algorithm that is actively degrading your attention span? Do you fly to Assyria through retail therapy, buying things you can't afford to project an image of success? Or maybe your Assyria is overworking, staying at the office until midnight so you don't have to face the smoldering oven of your failing marriage. We constantly seek shelter in the exact powers, habits, and systems that are designed to devour our peace.
And this concept of the divided heart, which Hosea explicitly names in chapter 10, verse 2, resonates deeply with broader human wisdom traditions. While across cultures, a divided internal state is recognized as the root of human suffering. If you look at Buddhist concepts of mindfulness, the primary goal is internal unity, bringing the mind, the body, and the present moment into one aligned state, free from the frantic flitting of attachment.
Right.
Or consider the Stoic philosophy of the internal locus of control. The Stoics argued vehemently against letting your internal state be divided and dictated by external empires or circumstances. A divided self, whether in 8th century BCE Israel or modern-day London or Tokyo, inevitably collapses under pressure because its foundational structure is compromised. It lacks integrity in the structural, architectural sense of the word.
It makes you wonder what your own frantic flight paths look like. This is where the practical application gets real for you listening. Where are your unturned cakes? Where is the glaring inconsistency between the public persona you project to the world, your resume, your polished networking face, and your private, behind closed doors reality?
That's the hard question.
And when the pressure is on, what are your Egypts and Assyrias? Naming those false safety nets is the first step to actually finding real rest. Because if you don't recognize the dove's flight pattern, you will never stop flying.
And that search for a way to manage the anxiety of a divided heart leads us directly into the next major insight. How did this ancient society try to cope with their lack of internal integrity? They didn't do the hard work of fixing the internal division. Instead, they tried to mask their inner emptiness with outward performative religion.
This is where we see the clash between performative goodness and authentic transformation. In chapter 6, verse 4, God essentially throws his hands up in exasperation and laments, "O Ephraim, what shall I do unto thee? Your goodness is as a morning cloud, and as the early dew it goeth away."
Yeah.
And then follows one of the most famous and foundational lines in the entire text, chapter 6, verse 6. "For I desired mercy, and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings." Let's analyze the mechanics of this morning cloud.
The commentators beautifully synthesize this meteorological imagery. In the geography of the ancient Near East, specifically during the dry season, the morning cloud and the early dew look incredibly promising. The moisture from the Mediterranean Sea rolls in overnight.
Okay.
If you are a farmer depending entirely on moisture for your survival, you wake up, you see the thick mist, you see the heavy dew glittering on the grass, and you feel a surge of hope. You think, the water we need is here. But it is an illusion of substance.
Because it doesn't actually penetrate the soil.
Exactly. It has no depth. As soon as the sun rises over the eastern mountains and the brutal heat of the day hits, that dew vanishes instantly. It evaporates before it can reach the roots.
Wow.
The text says their goodness, their piety, their ethical commitments were exactly like that morning mist.
Wow.
They made a massive public show of their religion. They brought expensive animal sacrifices to the altars. They funded the temple choirs and the incense. They thought they could buy off divine favor with elaborate religious theater.
The moment real ethical pressure was applied.
Right. The heat of the sun, a moment where it cost them something to tell the truth or help the poor, their goodness evaporated into thin air.
It's the ultimate bait and switch. You think you are dealing with a righteous person because of their public performance, but when you actually need them to show mercy, there's nothing there. And that's why the text hammers home that devastating line, "I desired mercy and not sacrifice."
God is saying, I don't need your livestock. I don't need your pageantry. True religion, the text argues, is the ethical treatment of others, mercy, and a deep-lived relationship with reality, the knowledge of God. It is not an outward performance meant to manage public relations with the divine.
Yeah.
This raises a profound philosophical question about how we fundamentally define goodness. Is goodness a ritual we perform, a box we check to maintain our status? Or is it a deeply ingrained character trait that we possess even when no one is watching?
That's the real test.
The Hebrew prophets were considered radical precisely because they looked at the most religious people in their society, the people keeping the temples running, strictly observing the feast days, and told them that their religion was completely worthless. It was worthless because their vertical worship did not translate into horizontal justice. It didn't result in fair scales in the marketplace or protection for the widow and the orphan.
And this translates so flawlessly to the 21st century. Listen, you might not be dragging a bull to an altar to appease an ancient deity today, but this text is a direct, piercing challenge to modern performative behaviors.
Oh, yeah.
Think about corporate greenwashing. A massive multinational corporation dumps toxic waste into a river, exploits labor in developing nations for 364 days a year, but on Earth Day, they change their corporate logo to a green leaf and sponsor a highly publicized 5K run for the environment. That is sacrifice without mercy.
Perfectly said.
They're buying the public relations of goodness without changing the ethics of their supply chain.
It is the exact same mechanism, just updated for the digital age. We love the performance of virtue because performance requires no internal transformation. A sacrifice is external. You can buy a sacrifice. You can outsource it. You can write a check to a charity, post the correct socially conscious hashtag, or attend a high-profile gala.
The mercy.
Mercy is internal. Mercy requires empathy. It requires you to lower your ego, surrender your advantage, and see the humanity of the person standing right in front of you. It requires a sustained, consistent ethical stance that does not evaporate when the heat of inconvenience rises.
It's the person who posts constantly about social justice online, portraying themselves as a paragon of virtue, while simultaneously treating their actual employees, the barista at the coffee shop, or their own spouse with absolute contempt. The gap between the hashtag and the reality is the evaporating morning cloud. So the reflection for you today requires profound honesty. What is your sacrifice? What is the performative thing you do, the volunteer board you sit on, the way you talk about politics at dinner parties, to feel like a good person, or to ensure others perceive you as a good person?
Yeah, look closely at that.
And then contrast that with your mercy. How do you actually treat the people who have absolutely nothing to offer you? How do you treat your subordinates when you are under severe stress? Because if your sacrifice is loud but your mercy is silent, your goodness is just a morning cloud.
And the tragedy of this performative lifestyle, as Hosea points out, is not merely that it fails to impress God. It is that a life devoid of structural integrity actively sets self-destructive forces into motion. You cannot live a performative, deceitful life without the structure eventually collapsing under its own weight.
Right. It catches up to you.
Which brings us to one of the most famous and universally recognized concepts to emerge from this text, the profound, inescapable law of the harvest, which Hosea explores in detail in chapters 8 and 10.
The imagery of sowing and reaping. In chapter 8, verse 7, the prophet delivers a line that has echoed through history. For they sow the wind, and they will reap the whirlwind. And then he expands on it in chapter 10, verse 13. You have plowed wickedness. You have reaped iniquity. You have eaten the fruit of lies. How do the mechanics of this ancient agrarian metaphor actually work?
Hosea is speaking to a society of farmers, so agricultural metaphors are the most devastatingly precise tool he can use. Every farmer knows the absolute, unbreakable laws of the harvest. First, you reap exactly what you sow. If you plant wheat, you get wheat. You don't get barley.
Makes sense.
Second, you reap later than you sow. There is a delay between the action and the consequence. And third, and most importantly, you reap more than you sow. When you plant a single tiny kernel of corn, you don't get one kernel back. Months later, you get a massive stalk with hundreds of kernels.
So it's a law of multiplication.
Exactly. So let's apply that to the text. When Hosea says they sow the wind, he means they are investing their time, energy, and resources into things that have no substance, no weight, no reality. They are investing in idolatry, performative religion, political deceit, and empty backroom alliances.
Okay.
But because of the law of the harvest, they don't just get an empty return. They don't plant a breeze and get a breeze back. They reap the whirlwind. The consequences of their empty, deceitful actions multiply in the dark over time, and they return as a massive, destructive, chaotic force that tears their entire society apart.
I want to focus on that delay you mentioned, the idea that you reap later than you sow.
Yeah.
Because one of the most chilling observations the commentaries make is how God's judgments or the natural consequences of our actions often begin completely silently. In chapter 5, the text says it starts like a moth in the clothes or rottenness in the wood.
Yes, that is a crucial observation about the nature of consequence. The whirlwind doesn't happen overnight. First, it is the moth. Think about how a moth operates.
It's sneaky.
Very. It does its destructive work silently, in the dark, hidden in the back of the closet. You have absolutely no idea your expensive garment is ruined. It looks fine on the hanger. You only discover the destruction when you finally pull it out to wear it, and it disintegrates in your hands.
Wow.
Similarly, rottenness, or termites in the wood, hollows out the structural beams of a house silently from the inside. The house looks perfectly stable to anyone walking by. The paint is fresh, but the internal integrity is gone. It remains standing only until the day a storm hits, and then the entire structure collapses instantly. To the outside observer, the collapse looks sudden. But the decay was happening silently for years.
Wait, this is exactly how the mechanics of compound interest work with our daily habits. We usually talk about compound interest in the positive light investing money or the power of reading 10 pages a day. We love positive compounding. But the exact same mathematical law applies to negative habits.
Absolutely.
A tiny, seemingly insignificant daily habit of deceit. Just cutting a small ethical corner at work, telling a little white lie to your partner to avoid an argument, indulging in a small hidden addiction. That is sowing the wind. It's the moth in the wardrobe. It seems completely harmless in the moment because there's no immediate lightning bolt of consequence. You get away with it.
So you do it again.
Right, so you do it again. But it compounds over decades. And eventually you wake up one day to a catastrophic life collapse, a sudden divorce, an abrupt firing, a massive public scandal. That is the whirlwind. The whirlwind is just the compound interest of the wind.
That is precisely the psychological and structural mechanism Hosea is describing. And because the law of the harvest is absolute, you cannot cheat it. The only way to change the harvest is to radically change what you are planting. Which leads us to the antidote, the harsh prescription found in chapter 10, verse 12. Sow to yourselves in righteousness, reap in mercy, break up your fallow ground.
Break up your fallow ground. I love the imagery.
Yeah.
But what does that brutal agricultural work actually mean for the listener trying to change their life?
Well, fallow ground is soil that was perhaps once productive but has been left unplanted and neglected for a long period of time. Over the years, the soil becomes hard as concrete, compacted by the weather, and deeply overgrown with stubborn weeds and thorns.
Right, it's just a mess.
Now, a novice farmer might try to just take good seed and scatter it over the fallow ground, but what happens? The seed just sits on the hard, compacted surface, where it is immediately scorched by the sun or eaten by birds. It can't take root.
Because the soil isn't ready to receive it.
Precisely. Before you can plant anything new, before you can hope for a harvest of mercy, you have to do the brutal, back-breaking, violent work of driving an iron plow deep into that hard dirt. You have to tear up the deeply entrenched roots of the weeds. You have to turn the dark soil over and expose it to the light. It is incredibly disruptive work.
And that is the sobering, practical truth for anyone listening who wants to change their life. We all want the good harvest. We want the deep, trusting relationships, the fulfilling career, the peaceful mind. But we approach it like a novice farmer.
We just scatter the seed.
Yeah, we just want to sprinkle some positive affirmations, a new morning routine, or some good vibes seed over our hard, compacted, weed-choked lives. We want transformation without disruption. But breaking up fallow ground means doing the deeply uncomfortable, often painful work of profound self-reflection.
It's not easy.
No, it means going to therapy and aggressively digging into childhood trauma you've ignored for 20 years. It means having that brutally honest, terrifying conversation with your spouse that you've been avoiding because it will cause conflict. It means doing the shadow work to unlearn toxic behaviors you inherited from your parents. It is painful to drive a plow into the dirt of your own ego, but if you refuse to break the fallow ground, you can never, ever plant the seeds of righteousness.
It is a profound, undeniable truth of human growth. But, as we move forward in the text, we have to acknowledge a major shift. While the agricultural metaphors of the harvest are insightful and the domestic metaphors of the oven are clever, Hosea does not stay in the realm of farming and baking. He transitions into incredibly harsh, violent imagery.
Yeah, it gets intense.
And if we are going to extract the full wisdom of this book, we cannot ignore the parts that offend our modern sensibilities.
No, we absolutely cannot. And I want to pivot to address the massive elephant in the room. Because if you read this text straight through, you're going to hit parts that are deeply uncomfortable, if not downright terrifying, for a modern reader.
Very much so.
In chapter 13, the text describes God in ways that sound like a horror story. God says, "I'm like a lion to them. Like a leopard, I will lurk by the path. I will meet them like a bear that is bereaved of her cubs and will tear the covering of their heart." And then just a few verses later, the text prophesies the coming military destruction. It says, Samaria will fall by the sword, infants will be dashed in pieces, and pregnant women ripped open.
It's brutal.
I have to stop here. How on earth do we extract enduring wisdom from a text that describes the divine acting like a violent, stalking predator and seems to foretell literal war crimes? Is this just ancient, bloodthirsty tribalism?
It is a vital question, and it is the primary obstacle for modern readers approaching ancient prophetic texts. It requires very careful historical discernment. If we take these texts out of their ancient Near Eastern context and read them through a 21st century lens, they sound like the ravings of a monster. But we must understand the geopolitical and covenantal reality of the world Hosea inhabited.
So unpack that for us. Why is this specific hyper-violent language being used?
First, we have to look at the suzerain vassal treaties of the ancient Near East. When a greater king, the suzerain, made a treaty or covenant with a lesser king, the vassal, the treaty always included blessings for obedience and curses for rebellion.
Okay, standard contract stuff.
Right. But the language of these curses was highly standardized across the ancient world. They invoked wild animals, lions, leopards, bears, as the agents of destruction if the treaty was broken. Hosea is using the standard legal and covenantal language of his day to say, you have completely shattered the treaty with the universe.
Okay, so it's a recognized legal metaphor. But what about the specific horrors regarding the infants and pregnant women? That's beyond metaphor. That's historical atrocity.
And sadly, it was literal historical reality. We mentioned earlier that the people of Israel, the silly dove, chose to ally themselves with the Assyrian Empire. We must be clear about who the Assyrians were. They were not a polite diplomatic nation. They were the terror of the ancient world.
They were notoriously cruel.
They pioneered calculated psychological warfare and absolute unmitigated brutality. They literally left stone monuments and reliefs boasting of doing exactly the things described in this chapter, dashing infants against rocks, mutilating captives, and ripping open pregnant women of rebellious vassal states to ensure no future generation could rise against them. They used terror as a tool of empire.
So the prophet isn't saying God is magically orchestrating these war crimes out of nowhere. He's saying this is the brutal empire you chose to jump in bed with.
Precisely. The prophetic language uses God's voice to describe the terrifying reality of the removal of protection. The Israelites wanted the Assyrians. They wanted to reject the ethical bounds of Yahweh's covenant and play power politics with an empire of blood.
Be careful what you wish for.
Right. The text is saying, fine, you are handed over to the reality you chose. By walking away from the source of life, they are left to the merciless geopolitical forces they trusted. The lion and bear metaphors illustrate the fierce, unyielding nature of reality and moral justice. You cannot rebel against the ethical order of the universe, ally yourself with violent, oppressive, dehumanizing systems, and not eventually be torn apart by the natural consequences of that alliance.
Let me try an analogy here. It's like a person who insists on jumping off a 10-story building, fully believing they can fly. When they hit the ground, the impact is catastrophic. It tears them apart. Now, you don't blame gravity for being evil or vindictive. Gravity is just the absolute law of the universe. If you step off the ledge, gravity will mercilessly crush you. God's moral law is the gravity here.
That is an excellent way to frame it. The moral universe has gravity. We do not have to blindly endorse ancient political violence or attribute human war crimes directly to the divine will to understand the profound, enduring wisdom here. The wisdom is that sin, betrayal, and systemic injustice lead to utter devastation.
It's just cause and effect.
When a society abandons truth, mercy, and knowledge, the end result is not a polite decline. The end result is violence, chaos, and horror. The lion, the leopard, and the bear are ancient metaphors for a reality that will absolutely not bend to accommodate our delusions.
But I have to say, after confronting that dark reality, it leaves you breathless. If the consequences of the whirlwind, the lion, and the bear are this severe, and if moral gravity is this merciless, is there any hope? Does the author just leave humanity to be torn apart by the lions of their own making? Because if that's where the deep dive ends, this is an incredibly bleak worldview.
It would be entirely bleak. But it is not the end. In fact, this brutal realization of consequence leads us directly to the emotional and theological climax of the entire book, found in chapter 11.
Yes, the tone shift here is so dramatic it almost gives you whiplash. We go from a bear tearing open a chest in the wilderness to a parent gently teaching a toddler how to walk in the living room.
It's beautiful.
In chapter 11, God says, "When Israel was a child, then I loved him. I taught Ephraim to walk. I took them by their arms. I drew them with cords of a man, with ties of love." And despite this tender care, the text says they continually rebelled. But instead of the lion pouncing to enact swift justice, God cries out with this immense, almost agonizing internal anguish. "How can I give you up, Ephraim? How can I hand you over, Israel? My heart is turned within me. My compassion is aroused."
The theological and philosophical shift here is staggering, especially when viewed against the backdrop of the ancient world. The surrounding nations worshiped stoic, transactional gods, gods who demanded blood, who were easily offended, and who wiped out entire populations without a second thought to maintain their divine honor.
But not here.
No. This text presents a God who experiences deep vulnerability, profound grief, and massive internal conflict. The omnipotent creator of the universe is depicted not as a distant, unfeeling judge, but as a heartbroken parent.
What exactly does that specific phrase mean, the cords of a man? It's a very evocative translation.
It is a direct contrast to how a farmer would lead a stubborn animal. You lead an ox or a mule with heavy leather harnesses, a yoke of iron and ropes, dragging them forward by sheer physical force and pain. Chords of a man, or human chords, represent leading with compassion, dignity, persuasion, and rational love.
Treating them with dignity.
God is saying, I treated you with humanity, I wooed you, I appealed to your intellect and your heart, I didn't enslave you or drag you like a beast of burden, and yet they still walked away. But the absolute climax of the book comes when God refuses to let the hammer of justice fall completely. The commentaries note something truly profound about verse 9, where God resolves this internal tension. He says, I will not execute the fierceness of mine anger. I will not return to destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not man.
Wait, let's pause right there. Because usually in our modern framing, we think of humans as the soft, forgiving ones, and God as the strict, unyielding judge who demands perfection. But this text completely flips that dynamic.
It flips it entirely. If God were a human king, an ancient Near Eastern dictator, he would have wiped them off the map for their treason without a second thought. Human justice demands total retaliation. Human ego demands that an insult be met with destruction.
Right, an eye for an eye.
But God says, I am God and not man. His divine holiness is proven not by his capacity to destroy, but by his staggering, unnatural capacity to withhold ultimate destruction and offer grace. His transcendent divine nature is most clearly seen in his unfathomable compassion, what we might call his stubborn grace.
So how does this ancient depiction of stubborn grace translate to us? I compare this to the deepest, most agonizing, unconditional human love we can possibly imagine. Think about a parent dealing with a profoundly addicted, destructive child.
That's a perfect parallel.
The child is lying, stealing from the family, manipulating everyone, destroying their own life, and tearing the family apart. The parent absolutely hates the addiction. They hate the destruction. Strict, cold justice demands they change the locks, kick the child out, and never speak to them again to protect themselves. But the parent's heart tears at the thought of abandoning the child to the streets. They cry out, "How can I give you up?" It is that agonizing tension between the necessary boundary of justice and the unbreakable tie of love.
And that is the profound challenge for the listener today. It asks a direct question about how you navigate the complexities of human relationships. How does this ancient vision of a God torn between justice and compassion challenge how you handle conflict?
Right. When someone wrongs you, when a colleague betrays you, or a friend deeply hurts you, do you immediately default to the lion? Do you go scorched earth? Do you cancel them, cut them off entirely, and demand their total social or professional destruction?
It's so easy to do that.
It is. Or do you allow yourself to feel the tension of the ties of love? Can you hold a firm, necessary boundary against the harmful behavior while still retaining the fundamental humanity and compassion for the person who hurt you? That is the essence of divine wisdom applied to human relationships.
It is incredibly difficult. It requires an immense amount of emotional maturity, but it is the only path to actual healing, both personally and societally. And having seen the depths of this stubborn grace, the book moves to its final chapter, chapter 14, to explore the mechanics of restoration. If the door of grace remains stubbornly open, exactly how does one walk through it and return from the brink of the whirlwind?
We finally arrive at chapter 14, and it is this beautiful, poetic, restorative conclusion. The prophet gives the people, and by extension us, very specific instructions. He says, take words with you and return to the Lord. And in response to those words, God makes a promise. I will be like the dew to Israel. He will blossom like the lily and send down his roots like Lebanon. From me your fruit is found.
Take words with you. It is such a simple yet profound instruction. Notice what God does not ask for in this moment of return. He doesn't ask for 1,000 bulls to be sacrificed. He doesn't ask for grain or money or a massive architectural project.
No building funds.
He doesn't ask for a new, elaborate, performative religious festival. He strips away all the ancient theater. He simply asks for sincere, articulate confession. He wants words. But as the commentaries point out, the heart must dictate to the tongue. It must be honest reflection. You have to intellectually and emotionally name the reality of what you've done.
Because words require clarity. You can't just throw money at a problem vaguely. You have to say, I did this and it was wrong. And when you finally do that, when you stop performing and start articulating truth, God's response is so poetically precise. He says, I will be like the dew.
The contrast here is intentional, brilliant, and essential to understanding the book. We talked earlier about the violent whirlwind of chapter 8, the loud, chaotic, deeply destructive force of consequences that tears a society apart. But God's restorative grace is not compared to a counter whirlwind. It is compared to the dew.
Think about the biological and atmospheric reality of dew.
Right. Dew is entirely silent. It is gentle, it is deeply refreshing to the soil, and crucially, it happens overnight, in the quiet, in the dark, and it happens daily. And what is the long-term biological result of that daily silent dew? The text says they will send down roots like Lebanon.
Explain the roots of Lebanon to us, because that's not a reference most people today understand.
Well, the cedars of Lebanon were legendary in the ancient world. They were massive, towering trees that grew in the mountains north of Israel. But their strength wasn't just in their height, it was in their root systems. Because they grew in rocky, mountainous terrain, their roots had to drive incredibly deep into the earth, wrapping around solid bedrock to find moisture and stability. Because of those deep roots, a cedar of Lebanon was practically unshakable. It could withstand massive mountain storms and hurricane-force winds without breaking.
So look at the journey we've taken. We go from the morning cloud in chapter 6, that flashy, fake, performative goodness that looks great at dawn but completely burns off by 9 a.m. when the heat turns up, to deep, invisible roots wrapped around bedrock that can withstand a Category 5 storm. The daily, silent dew is what creates the unshakable roots.
Exactly. It is the ultimate contrast. Transient, anxious performance versus enduring, quiet stability.
So, practically speaking, I'm addressing you directly right now. If you are exhausted by the anxiety of the silly dove, if you are terrified of the whirlwind you see coming, stop trying to buy your way out of guilt. Stop with the frantic busyness, the overworking, the performative actions on social media trying to prove to the world that you are a good person.
It's exhausting.
Just take words. Sit in the quiet. Articulate your failures honestly to yourself, to the people you've hurt, and to the divine. And then allow the dew of grace to do its slow, quiet work. You won't be fixed in an hour. You won't have a massive cinematic breakthrough. But day by day, morning by morning, that gentle moisture will help you grow deep roots.
That is the path of true wisdom. And it is exactly how the author chooses to end the entire book. In the final verse, Hosea 14.9, he steps back from all the poetry and metaphors and delivers a direct challenge to the reader. Who is wise that he may understand these things? Who is prudent that he may know them? For the ways of the Lord are right, and the righteous walk in them, but the rebellious stumble in them.
That's a dark choice.
It is the ultimate binary call to alignment with reality. You have seen the consequences of the divided heart. You have seen the destruction of the performative life. You understand the law of the harvest. Now, armed with that knowledge, choose the path of wisdom.
Which leaves us with one final provocative thought for you to explore on your own today. Think deeply about that contrast between the dew and the whirlwind. We live in a society that is absolutely addicted to whirlwinds.
Oh, without a doubt.
We love loud, sudden, destructive forces of change. We love internet outrage, viral takedowns, overnight life hacks, and massive, disruptive revolutions. We want everything to happen instantly and loudly. But what if true, lasting transformation in your life can never happen in a whirlwind? What is the actual healing of your mind, the mending of your broken relationships, and the stabilization of our society can only happen like the dew, silently, gently, and consistently overnight when absolutely no one is watching? That's the heart of this section. This is Wisdom for the Present, where understanding leads to clarity, and clarity shapes how we see and live. We'll see you in the next episode.